The Philippines, an archipelagic Southeast Asian country situated in the Western Pacific, made up of about 7,641 islands, with a population of about 109 million people. It's one of the world's most important emerging markets, with the third highest nominal GDP in Southeast Asia. It's a market brimming with possibilities, with plenty of opportunities for savvy investors. But where do you begin when it comes to the Philippines? What are the long-term prospects for business? What are the opportunities and challenges? Where do you get your information? Since its founding in 1967, the Center for Research and Communication, or CRC, has grown to become one of the country's most important research and consultancy institutions, continuously providing innovative business advice through its diverse pool of experts across a tapestry of different business fields. Among the most important of these experts is Dr. Bernardo M. Villegas, CRC's Director of Research and one of the Philippines' most eminent economists. Dr. Villegas has been advising Philippine presidents on industrial policy formulation and investment promotion since the 1970s. His influence has been so great that when the Philippines created its new constitution in 1987, Dr. Villegas was immediately tapped to be a member of the Constitutional Convention. Here now to speak about the Philippine economy as a top emerging market, the Center for Research and Communication is proud to welcome Dr. Bernardo M. Villegas.
Greetings to potential and actual investors in the Philippines from the Indo-Pacific region. Since I'm assuming that investors who are looking at the Philippines are here for the long haul, the long term, my focus will be the Philippine economy as a top emerging market over the next 10 or more years. I say that because it is possible for investors, both domestic and international, to be too distracted by the short-term challenges, the temporary blips resulting from the pandemic. And indeed, if you take a look at the Philippines over the next 12 to 18 months, you will tend to get discouraged because we will not see the light at the end of the tunnel of the pandemic very soon. The most recent statistics showed that in the third quarter, the Philippines posted another decline of 11.5% after a decline of 16.9% in the second quarter. And there will continue to be declines in the coming quarters, even in the first quarter of 2001. So I'm not very optimistic about a quick recovery in the new year, because I'm realistic enough to accept the possibility that, as is happening in some of the most developed countries in Europe and in the US, there may be second or even third waves of the virus. And that may prompt our government, both at the national and especially at the local levels, to impose further lockdowns, which would mean, once again, the economy, especially consumption spending, declining. So I am not that optimistic over a 6 to 8 month period. But my main focus will be on how outside analysts, whether it be think tanks, financial institutions, credit rating agencies, see the Philippines over a longer term, let's say over a decade. And I am glad to report that the Philippines is cited as one of the most promising emerging markets to invest in if you take a long-term view. And let me stress that these are assessments being made independently. They are not self-serving propaganda of our government or even economists like me who are referred to as prophets of boom, overly optimistic. These are very objective views that I will cite in this briefing. Why do outsiders think highly of the Philippine economy over the long term? I can present a few strong fundamentals that I think they consider when they are bullish about us. Let me start with the first distinct advantage that we have. This is what I refer to as the geographic advantage of the Philippines, being at the epicenter of the region that will be the most dynamic in the world over at least the next 10 to 20 years. And let me explain. I'm sure many of you have heard about the last century being referred to as the American century. And indeed, the last century was one in which the US was supreme economically, as well as militarily and politically. Of course, with some challenges from time to time from Japan and from the EU, but there's no question that the US was on top of the global economy. To be more accurate, probably we can say that the last century was a three-cornered competition among the US, EU, and Japan. Now, if you take a look at the lower tables, just before the pandemic, these countries of the so-called American century were struggling just to grow at 0.8% for Japan to a high of 2.9% of the US. And there's no reason to believe that after the global economy recovers from the pandemic, that these territories can grow faster. They are already with very high per capita incomes, and especially for the Eurozone and Japan, they are burdened with a demographic problem. Very rapid aging and very low fertility rates, which dampen their economic prospects. Now take a look at the countries that are part of the so-called Asian century this century. China, India, and the ASEAN Economic Community. Before the pandemic, they were growing at anywhere from an average of 5.2% for the ASEAN 5. And let me just mention that the Philippines was above average. It was growing at more than 6%. And India was growing at 7.1% and China at 6.6%. There is all reason to believe that once the global economy recovers, these growth rates will once again be registered. And in fact, I'm sure you know that China today is the only important economy that is posting a positive growth rate. And you see the growth rates in the Asian century are 2 to 3 times those of the growth rates of the American century. And the Philippines, I repeat, is right in the middle of this region, which fortunately has not been inflicted with the inward-looking, anti-trade, anti-globalization mentality that you see in the US, America first, or in the UK, Brexit. We are in this region still very open to trade with one another. In fact, there has been this recent announcement about the regional comprehensive economic partnership in which 5 more countries are joining the ASEAN Economic Community in efforts to promote better and more open trade. That is one of the reasons why the Philippines is rated highly by outside analysts. Let me just remind you of what more than 15 years ago, a Goldman Sachs economist by the name of Jim O'Neill coined the acronym BRIC, representing Brazil, Russia, India, and China. I'm sure you remember when BRIC was being touted as the leading emerging markets for many years to come. Unfortunately for Brazil and Russia, their leaders mismanage part of their economies, and people are no longer as excited about these two huge markets. India and China continue to be very attractive. And now we add the ASEAN Economic Community. Just as an aside, more than 10 years ago, when the BRIC leaders met in China, they felt a little guilty that there was no African country included in their club, so they added South Africa. As you can see from the figures, the dimensions of South Africa are very far from the other regions. The same economist, Jim O'Neill, also talked about the next 11 emerging engines of growth. And you will see among these 11, only 3 Southeast Asian countries. And the way to remember them is to think of the acronym VIP, not very important person, but Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Indeed, these are the 3 huge economies that will dominate the ASEAN Economic Community for years to come. They're very large markets. They're very rich in natural resources, especially Indonesia. And they have managed to build institutions that lead to economic stability. One of the most recent assessments of emerging markets was made by the prestigious Oxford Economics Group in November 2019, just before the pandemic. And if you take a look at the ranking, India ranks number 1, the Philippines is number 2, Indonesia is number 3, and China is number 4, and so on and so forth. China, despite the fact that, as I said, it's the only one posting a positive growth rate during the pandemic, is only 4th in the list of Oxford Economics, because in the next 10 years, it is going to be troubled by the aging of the population because of the one-child policy that it followed for a long time, which is trying to reverse now, but without any success. China's growth is dampened by a demographic crisis. India is still growing. India will actually have a larger population, probably in 5 years, than China. And the Philippines is one of the few countries in this region that can boast of a young, growing, and in this particular case, English-speaking population. During the pandemic already, the prestigious economic publication, The Economist, came out with selected emerging economies ranked on 4 measures of financial strength. And as you can see, the Philippines was ranked number 6, besting Thailand, Saudi Arabia, China, Vietnam, Poland, Nigeria, and so on and so forth. Why do I think that The Economist thinks highly of the Philippines in terms of financial strength? The reason is we have one of the best central banking systems in this region, manned by very professional people, independent of politics. And we have a pool of very competent fiscal managers, now headed by Secretary Dominguez. And there are a lot more people like Secretary Dominguez who can continue the discipline of our fiscal managers over the last 10 to 15 years, keeping our debt to GDP ratio at a very low level of 30 to 40. I'm sure you know that there are countries like the US, Japan, Italy, Spain that have debt to GDP ratio of anywhere from 100 to 200%. So our ratio of 30 to 40% is remarkable. And that is a great advantage right now because since it is to borrow a lot in order to stimulate the economy, we have tremendous leeway to borrow and our credit standing is good. So we can even bring this ratio to 70% of GDP without leading to financial instability. And that definitely is a strength that outsiders see in us. Let me just cite one of the longest term projections made by Hong Kong Shanghai Bank almost 20 years ago. This was when we were still called by outsiders as the sick man of Asia. Let me stress that many of these positive assessments are being made despite the fact that the analysts are conscious of our many weaknesses: corruption, a very poor agricultural sector, inability even to manage the pandemic as efficiently as countries like Vietnam, South Korea, and so on and so forth. But they always see beyond these weaknesses because of the strengths that I have enumerated. And Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, when we were still the sick man of Asia, prognosticated that in 2050, the Philippines would be the 16th largest economy in the world, GDP-wise. And take a look at the countries that we are supposed to surpass: Indonesia, Australia, Argentina, Malaysia, Egypt, Thailand, etc. And one, again, of the most recent assessments already during the pandemic was done by the Japan Credit Rating Agency that upgraded our credit rating from BBB+ to A-. And that is why today creditors are very willing to lend money to our government so that our government can really play a major role, not only addressing the problems of the pandemic, but of actually stimulating the economy back to recovery. And I'm sure you all know that the IMF is telling countries, be more aggressive in stimulating the economy. Don't worry about borrowing too much. Let me now summarize briefly what I already have referred to as our strong fundamentals. The first, demographic dividend, young, growing, and English-speaking population, which gives us a tremendous advantage, number one, in sending more than 10 million of our workers abroad as overseas Filipino workers, earning $33 billion of remittances that, when brought back to the Philippines to the relatives of these overseas workers, are the important source of consumption spending, which is the number one engine of growth of the Philippine economy. About 70% of our GDP is explained by consumption. And this young, growing, and English-speaking population also gives us a lot of competitive advantage in the business process outsourcing IT sector, together with India, where we are able to support multinational corporations all over the world in the business services that they need, cutting down significantly their costs. And this sector is going to bounce back very quickly once the developed world retains some normalcy after the pandemic. Then I already referred to the geographic dividend, our being right in the middle of this very dynamic Indo-Pacific region. Then let me refer to what I call temporal dividend. I'm referring to the fact that in the next 10 to 20 years, our economy will be traversing what the Engel law describes as a shift from very basic commodities that the population would consume to a variety of goods and services that are discretionary spending, meaning all types of industrial products and services that will be needed by this population of 110 million people who now will be upper middle class in category and no longer lower middle class. And that would lead to an explosion of demand for consumer goods and services in the domestic market. We don't even have to depend too much on export, in the same way that China and Indonesia are not that export dependent. Our businesses, as well as foreign investors, can just focus on selling to the domestic market to make a profit. We also continue to have abundant natural resources like Indonesia and Vietnam, agricultural, mineral, and in the Philippine case, in the area of tourism. Once foreign tourism recovers, let's say 2 to 3 years from now, we will be one of the top destinations of these foreign tourists. In the meanwhile, we are going to count on our domestic tourists. Before the pandemic, there were 60 million of us traveling outside of our home to the hundreds, if not thousands, of islands that have very attractive tourist destinations. Some of you might have noticed that a leading magazine on travel and tourism ranked our Palawan Island as the #1 resort island in the world today, besting Bali. And for your information, Palawan has 2,000 islands in its system. We have all these resources that can help us rebuild our tourism industry once the pandemic is licked, let's say 2 to 3 years from now. We are fortunate that the Duterte government has started this Build program. You know, we used to spend only about 2% of our GDP on infrastructures. Under this present government, that has been brought up to about 6 to 7%, and we are sure that the next administrations, at least the next 2 administrations, will continue this Build program. It's so obvious that we are way behind our neighbors, especially if you look at South Korea, Taiwan, China, and Japan, not to mention even just Vietnam. We have not really spent enough on infrastructures, and we need this Build program for a long time to come, which will be an engine of growth of the Philippine economy. I'm also happy to report that there are regions in the Philippines that are growing faster in the National Capital Region. So we are seeing now areas south of Manila called Calabar Zone, especially the province of Batangas, areas in Central Luzon, especially the so-called Pampanga Triangle, San Fernando, Angeles, Clark, and Subic, former U.S. bases. These areas are the new megapolis urban centers that will replace Manila as a center of industrial development. In the Visayas, the most attractive city today is called Iloilo, that will replace to a certain extent the industrial center of Cebu, which is also overcrowded. And in Mindanao, the most promising city is the city from which our president comes, Davao. Very rich in all types of resources, agricultural, industrial, and so on and so forth. And Davao will definitely grow. Actually, it has been growing already faster than Manila for a number of years. Obviously, we have many challenges still to face. And the #1 is our very low agricultural productivity. We really stick out like a sore thumb in Southeast Asia when we're compared to Thailand, to Malaysia, now even to Vietnam in the area of agricultural productivity. And this is because of decades of neglect. Our governments were not focusing on countryside development. They were so obsessed in the wrong kind of industrialization that they wasted resources that should have been spent on farm-to-market roads, irrigation systems, post-harvest facilities, all the resources that our small farmers needed to be productive. But we kept them in poverty because of this neglect. There are now signs that that is changing. In fact, I'm happy to report that despite big declines in practically all sectors of the economy during the pandemic, the agriculture sector is the only one that posted a positive growth of 1.2%. That is a good sign. And I attribute that also to the fact that we have a very competent Secretary of Agriculture, very experienced, very knowledgeable, and that is now leading to his putting the necessary foundation for the long-term growth of agricultural productivity. We still have, unfortunately, too many obstacles to doing business. Red tape, bribery, especially at the local government levels, And we still have constitutional restrictions against foreign direct investors. In fact, we suffer from comparison in this regard with Vietnam, that is more open to foreign investors than we are. Some of us are trying hard to convince our government to remove those restrictions. It's also a paradox that despite the fact that we have many young people, there's a shortage of technical skills. This is a psycho-sociological problem where parents and young people look down on blue-collar skills, very much probably inherited from our US background where everyone wants to have a college diploma. We are now trying to convince more and more of our young people not to pursue a college degree, but to become good plumbers, electricians, carpenters, welders. That takes obviously a lot of marketing. And some of us are very much on top of that. We still have very high rates of electricity compared to our neighbors. The good news is practically all the large conglomerates are investing in power plants. The bad news with the environmentalists is that most of these power plants are still coal-powered. And the reason is that it's still the most effective way of bringing down costs. The renewable energy at the moment still leads to high costs. That might change, but looking at the long-term forecast of the Department of Energy, coal would be with us for a long time to come. Corruption and poor governance exists in a big way still. In fact, our president has been very vocal about corruption in the Department of Public Works, Department of Health, and so on and so forth. My only consolation is I see first world countries like South Korea and Malaysia that have attained first world status, even if they have not completely eradicated corruption. So we're not losing hope. We may not be able to completely remove corruption, but we can still become a first world country if we have the right economic policies. As you probably have read, in the last few days, we have been hit by some of the super typhoons that always cross the Philippines. We have had natural calamities, people dying, homes being destroyed by floods. The only response is obviously preparedness. So we hope our government, together with civil society, can be more and more prepared to take care of the victims of these natural calamities. I just wanted to show you why it is possible for us to aspire to rapid changes in our per capita income. Take a look at 1980. China had a per capita income of only $307 US, compared to the Philippines as $782. Of course, Malaysia was on top of all of us. In fact, the Philippines was number 2 only to Malaysia. But because of very erroneous economic policies, neglect of agriculture, inward-looking industrialization, through the years, our neighbors surpassed us. And especially spectacular was the way China was able to grow its per capita income from $307 in 1980 to $10,582. Since we are now trying to retrace the steps of China in terms of market reforms, it is possible that in the next 10 to 20 years, we also can aspire to be like China, growing at not probably at a 12% growth rate that happened after Deng Xiaoping introduced market reforms, but at least at the rate of 8 to 10% in the coming years, once the reforms that I referred to are implemented. Exports of goods, we also are performing very poorly. We have the lowest exports, especially of goods. Thanks to services, we are able to have at least 106 billion, still the lowest, but our exports of goods definitely will not be able to compete with our neighbors. It's too late in the day for us to be a top performer in the export of manufactured goods. We lost the chance in the last century. Now there are many other competitors, not only Vietnam, but Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, that would have cheaper wages. That is why our focus really should be on educated manpower to be exported abroad or to be used in business process outsourcing and similar high-tech industries. If you ask which sectors will recover faster than others, those so-called V-shape, there are four that I identify. Also for your consideration for investment. The whole area of food and agribusiness, and as you know, the biggest concern of the world, starting with China, is food security. And when I talk about agribusiness, I just don't mean farming. I mean the whole value chain. The post-harvest cold storage, logistics, processing, retailing. That is an area where a lot more investments can be poured into the Philippines. The second is obvious. The pandemic has awakened the consciousness of populations all over the world, including the Philippines, about the importance of investing in more hospitals, more clinics, and investing in both curative and preventive measures of improving health and wellness, not only in terms of medical solutions, but also physical fitness. So all of these types of expenditures will definitely increase after the pandemic. Now, it's clear that the digital industry, what we're doing right now, is part of the digital industry. It doesn't have to recover because during the pandemic, it increased by leaps and bounds. Just think of all the education that's been delivered online. Just think of all the trade that is being done electronically, etc., etc. That is definitely going to be what people refer to as Industrial Revolution 4.0. We will also see the education sector being a sunrise sector and not necessarily the formal educational sector. In fact, we've lost millions of people who were not able to enroll during the pandemic. I'm referring to all means of improving the skills and knowledge of our working population through formal, informal means, webinars, workshops, non-degree programs. That will be a very big business in the future. The ones that will recover very slowly are travel and tourism, except probably for domestic tourism, as long as we're not going to be imposing more and more strict lockdowns. Transport and automotive industry, for obvious reasons. Malls and other retailing outlets which require crowded places. Same thing with dining restaurants, public entertainment, and high-end real estate. The part of real estate that has not suffered is what we call low-cost and economic housing. In peso terms, those units that cost anywhere from 800,000 pesos to about 5 million. Those still have huge markets among our 10 million overseas workers and our 1.5 million BPO workers. In the third quarter, as I said, there was another drop of minus 11.5% after a drop of 16.9% in the second quarter. There's, as we will see, for the whole year, there are estimates of anywhere from 7 to 11% drop for the whole year, which is one of the highest drops we've encountered since the Second World War. As I said, agriculture was the only one that posted a positive growth rate compared to minus 17.2 in industry and minus 10.6 of services. So these are just the different sectors. And if you take a look at the positive growth rates, it's financial insurance activities that still grew at 6.2%. Then you have public administration and defense at 4.5%. Obviously, it's because it's the government spending. And it's agriculture, forestry and fishing that grew at 12.2%, and information and communication that grew at 0.8%. So these are the positive growth rates, and you have electricity, water, and other public utilities that grew at 0.2%. So those are the sectors that have been growing even during the pandemic and can be expected to recover ahead of the others. The ones that really plummeted is accommodation and food service activities, dropping at 52.4%. That's hotels and tourism-related activities. So in terms of expenditures, it was only the government that had an increase in its expenditure of 4.8%. All other sectors suffered very big declines. So this is the forecast for 2020. I dare not even forecast for 2021. As I said, we are very much at the mercy of the pandemic. Anything I say about 2021 will be a pure guess. But we can say something a little more definite about what will happen for the rest of the year. So inflation rate will average 2.5. Probably that's the good news. Peso dollar rate, 50 to 51, is more my wish than an actual forecast. As those of you who are watching our currency know, it's still at 48 pesos to a dollar. It's very strong. One of the strongest currencies right now in the ASEAN. In my opinion, our monetary authorities should be managing the currency to a certain extent to make it depreciate to 50 to 51, because it's very unfair that we are giving our overseas workers, with all the sufferings that they endure abroad, only 48 to 1 for the dollars that they send to their relatives. And the same thing with our exporters. As you know, China had been managing its currency to make it depreciate in the past to give the exporters an advantage. So there is such a thing as managing the foreign currency. But obviously, there's a difference of opinion between some of us and the central bank authorities. And they're very confident to keep our peso strong because we have huge gross international reserves. As of today, there's already $104 billion. So as I said, for the whole year of 2020, we may have 7.5 to 9.5 range. It may actually be higher or lower, not lower. I don't think it'll be lower than minus 7.5. It will be higher than 9.5, depending on the number of new waves of the virus that we will encounter in the next 6 months. Industry sector will continue to decline. There may be service sector improvement, especially with insurance and finance and BPO services. That is the end of my briefing. I hope I have enlightened you on why the Philippines, if you take a long-term view, is one of the most promising emerging markets in which to invest. Thank you very much.